So today I would like to discuss a very interesting historical aspect of our watchmakers. And this is of the Montandon watchmaking dynasty. And what I would like to discuss today is an exodus. This exodus we see happening between 1770, approximately 1770 and 1825. So this would be, we see the very beginnings of these exodus happening in Europe, from Switzerland to various other locations. And this is more or less an attempt to seek greener pastures. We will see this really take off during, right around the time of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, because of the economic difficulties that were being experienced in the community, especially during the continental blockade during the Napoleonic Wars. We see a lot of this happening at that time. But let us discuss, and we have a dozen individuals here. These are early watchmakers and specialists who we see leaving Switzerland for these other locations in Europe and abroad. And the first one that I would like to discuss is a David Montandon, who went to Paris. Now, David Montandon was as early as 1755 in the watch trade as an orfèvre, or a goldsmith, and he would also go into the watchmaking side as well as merely just the goldsmithy. But David Francois Montandon left his area of La Bravine, Switzerland, for Paris. He's certainly after 1755, but by 1770 we see him in Paris, and he was approved by the government of Louis XV of France for selling watches and operating as a watchmaker in France and in Paris indeed. So we do have his, we do find his permission from the King's Council, and this is in 1770, and he's would be partnering later with Yearning, and we find their watches signed from the 1780s and the 1790s as Yearning et Montandon à Paris. And one of his watches is in the Louvre collection. It's not on public display, but it is in their collection. And this is one of the oldest Montandon watches. A second watch is older than this, and this is in my own collection. And these watches are the only known pocket watches that survive, that have been documented by this watchmaking pair. Now, there are two mantle clocks, which are bronze doré, marbre doré, and these are very interesting astronomical clocks, mantle clocks, with multiple complications. Now, moving down to the second individual who departed on this exodus, this was to Berlin, and this was probably between 1765 and 1771, and this is Jean-Jacques Montandon Lalonde, and he was working in Potsdam, Berlin area at the factory of Abraham Louis Huguenin, and this was the Inspector General for the King of Prussia, Frederick the Great. Established him as the Inspector General of watchmaking for the kingdom in order to encourage the flourishing of this industry in his kingdom. So they took these Swiss specialists, and Jean-Jacques Montandon was an engraver at this factory. And it's quite interesting. We see these early makers going abroad like this. Now, there is a third individual who also went to Kingdom of Prussia, and this was to Krefeld, which was a possession of Prussian kingdom. And this is David Frederick Montandon, and we find him around 1784 to 1785. And he was selling watches and other products. Later, he would go into more textiles. However, during the 1780s, 1790s, right up to about 1800, we find him in the watch trade. Now, apparently, he must have totally departed the watch trade after this time. It was probably due to this Napoleonic blockade that was happening at the time after 1800. But after that, we no longer see him involved in watch-related sales. It is interesting that it is documented that in his shop, some French Revolutionary Army went into Krefeld, and a sergeant and several of his underlings, they were hussars, went into his shop and commandeered a gold watch. The troops actually paid for silver watches, several silver watches, but the sergeant commandeered a golden watch from David Frederick's shop, and this was this really caused a big stir in the community there. Very bad emotions after this happened. We can see this in history of Krefeld. But now let us move to number 4, and this is around the same time, the late 1780s to around 1790, around the French Revolution. This was Balthazar Montandon, who went to Clermont in France. And Balthazar would team up with André Alphand. Now, this is probably during the Ancien Régime, so it's more likely that the 1780s, because at this time he definitely would have needed a French partner established in business. And his business partner was André Alphand, and they were also a Swiss family, but they had already established themselves in France. They're originally from Geneva, and we find watches and clocks. But mainly this partner, we have some watches. They're signed Alphand et Montandon à Clermont, and there is a gold pocket watch by this partnership that has been documented, and a silver pocket watch, which is actually a unique watch. This has a gold small hand on a subdial, and the subdial is in a decimal, the French Revolutionary timekeeping system based on 10. And this was submitted for a competition in 1794. However, for some reason, the pocket watch was rejected. It didn't fulfill the criteria of the competition, the rules, and it was returned to the watchmakers who, they were Freemasons, and they, one of the friends of theirs was the mayor of Clermont-Ferrand, at the time Clermont, and so this watch was presented to the mayor as a gift, and it has remained in the mayor's family for generations up till today. And I've actually seen this watch, like the Louvre Yearning Montandon watch, this Alphand et Montandon à Clermont, the only revolutionary Montandon watch, French decimal system. Quite interesting. Now we do have another person departing at this time, and this is around 1784 and 1785. And this was Henri Louis Montandon, who went to London, and he was in business on his own. He had his own, this would have been a watch repair and a watch fabrication atelier in London. We find his letters to his parents, and he was doing rather well. And it's not exactly clear why he left London, but we do know that he was making decent money. And he was apparently connected with the Drozes, who were doing these robots for the Chinese market. So perhaps he was doing some form of cooperation with them, but he at least was on terms with them. This is rather fascinating. But Henri Louis would go from here afterwards to Vienna, Austria. And he was part of a collective, a factory which began working in the city in Vienna, and it's quite interesting. They were occupying a monastery, and this project was backed by the King of Austria, the Emperor, I should say. And when the Emperor died, and this was Joseph, I believe, when he died, this project more or less ceased receiving royal support, and it more or less it functioned approximately 11 years. Now, in the early 1790s, it was already clear after the death of the emperor that this was not doing well, and it was very difficult. Indeed, in the letters to his parents, we find Henri Louis and he was referred to in the local documentation as Heinrich. So it was Henri, but Heinrich Montandon, he was Macher Gesell was his title in the factory. He was working with watch chains for Fob Fusee watches, and this he equated his wages with slavery at this point, and this was not a good venture. And he left Vienna we find him materializing in the United States in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and he was known as the watchmaker of the borough in Lancaster, and he died in 1802. He died very young, around the age of 35 or 37, somewhere around this area. But we find that he had already established himself with his wife in business, Hanna, and Montandon did continue this watch business with her son Albert, and one of the workers would eventually marry her and continue this business. And Albert would go to another location in the United States, in the Midwest, also carrying on the watch trade for some time. But this is a very interesting individual who we find him in 3 different places. He was quite mobile, but died at such an early age, and clearly he was a very go-getter, as one would say. Now, we do have another interesting individual, and this is Daniel Louis Montandon, who we find by 1791 going to Montbéliard, and this is in France. And it's not exactly clear how long he was operating and what his situation was, but we do find him there. And of course, this was after the French Revolution, and it's interesting that we see these movements happening at this time. Now, there is another individual who we have leaving. This is just at the tail end of the French Revolution, and this was in 1815. And he's actually a whole family who's left, and this is the family of Pierre-Henri Montandon, who left. Now, his son Julien had been working on the western coast seaboard of France. We find him actually in the lowlands. Find him in the lowlands and on the western French seacoast in various locations. And clearly he is scouting out an opportunity to go to America. And this is exactly what they did in 1815. And the entire family went to Elizabethtown, New Jersey, which is just across the drink from New York City. And they were operating in the beginning a watch shop, an atelier in New York City, but the family would disperse within 10 years of the immigration, about 10 to 12 years. We find Julien already by 1827 in Washington, D.C., where he had a watch shop on Pennsylvania Avenue, 2 blocks from the White House. And indeed, we find him collaborating with multiple presidents of the United States, 3 at least, and he would have known Thomas Jefferson because his sister's husband, Louis Lachaud, was hired to be the watchmaker in Thomas Jefferson's local community, and the family was a regular guest at the Jefferson home. And indeed, after the death of Louis Lachaud and Sophie Montandon, and this was separated by decades, over 2 decades, both individuals were interred at the Jefferson family cemetery plots. So this is the only non-family members that are buried in Jefferson's Monticello plantation with the Jefferson family. This shows the closeness of these individuals to the former president. Jefferson himself had died in the 1820s, I believe, and I think Louis Lachaud died around 6 years after Jefferson, yet the bonds were still that strong that they were honored in this way, which is rather fascinating. And Jefferson was buying their products. Indeed, we have records of him buying watches and other silver items. Now, the next interesting movement we find from Neuchâtel in Switzerland to Copenhagen, Denmark, and this is another Henry Louis Henri Louis, and this was probably before 1817. And he established a watch shop in Copenhagen, and he was a master watchmaker. And we find many watches and clocks by his hand. And he signed this H.L. Montandon à Copenhagen. And it's always, his pieces are always signed in this way. But it is interesting that he established his watch business around 1817, but almost immediately went to France for 5 years, and he was apparently apprenticing, and this very well have been with his relatives who were setting up Montandon Frères in 1818 in Paris. Now that is also an entire group that we find moving. It's not exactly clear, but certainly during the Napoleonic period they had moved into Paris and established a this would become later the biggest Montandon watch fabricator, Montandon Frères. Now we move on. There is also, I neglected to mention, during the French Revolution, and this was in 1793, a watch collective was set up in Besançon, France, and this was a factory of employing hundreds, 800 people, something along this variety, of watchmakers leaving Switzerland to participate in a Jacobin project by Megavon. Megavon started this watch factory to encourage watch production in France, and it was also functioning around a decade, at least a decade, but it would be largely unsuccessful. But there's a large group of Montandon watch specialists who did make the journey, including with their own tools, to work in this factory. And this factory wasn't a normal modern version of a factory, but a series of connected watch shops, ateliers in one location. They may have been in the same building, but it's not a modern production of it by any sort. And they would run into a lot of problems with regards to this overall success, this economic feasibility of this project. But it is interesting that many of these watchmakers would remain in France, and it is because of them that later watch fabrication efforts in Besançon became a success, because of this heavy concentration, this early attempt. Now, we are already, let's go back to the post-Napoleonic period, and we find mention in Brussels, Belgium, in 1821 of a François Montandon, and he was definitely working in some watch enterprise at the time, and we find him mentioned as a witness at a wedding for another Swiss watchmaker. So he was clearly involved in some sort of an enterprise with these other Swiss in Brussels, and it is not exactly clear which Francois this is. This could be a Victor Francois Emmanuel, who was a highly trained watchmaker. He would have been more advanced in age, and this would have been one of probably a project of his own, if not a co-partner. However, if it is not him, then it is most certainly then his son, Francois Aimé, who would have been at the apprentice age at this time. So once again, it's most likely that this was the son. This was Francois Aimé. And we do find this 1821 mention of a Francois Montandon, watchmaker, as a witness at the wedding. Now, interestingly, a very close relative of the pair would also be noted in 1826 as having been married in Mons, Belgium. And this was Louis Auguste Montandon, and he was a later very celebrated watchmaker who was most likely signing Louis Montandon Geneva. There's the chance he was the person behind L. Montandon Law Club, but this to me seems less likely. That definitely he was established as early as 1840s. We find him in Davoine Almanacs listed, and he continued in business until at least 1870. And after that, we don't see him in the almanacs anymore. But and he would become a very instrumental figure behind the Republican movement in Switzerland after the troubles of 1848. He was part of the provisional government. and we actually have a picture of him. So he most likely was doing some sort of early watch training apprenticeship in Belgium with these relatives and these other Swiss immigrants who were working in the country. Now, the last individual we find during this early Exodus period between 1870 and 1825, this was Frédéric Auguste Montandon, also Lalonde, and he was going to, we find him in Limoges by 1822, and I believe he also did time working in Marseille, but he certainly departed from Marseille by 1825, and we find him going to Brazil, and he was in Rio de Janeiro, and later he would go further inland where there was almost no competition, and he set up a watch shop deeper inland. But he was also, I believe, in Santos at one point before he went to this Araxa, in this interior location. And at one point he became, I believe he left the watch trade altogether. He may have had people working in his shops for him after that point, but he began to raise cattle on a very large scale. And he seems to have become very wealthy. And one of his sons was educated as a doctor and later became fundamentally the head of the provisional government in Brazil. He was the head of it's the district where the capital of Brazil is Brasilia. He was in charge of this district as its governor. So this is quite fascinating. But these are a dozen or so of these early watchmakers that spread the name across Europe. And the fame associated with this name we'll find by mid-century, this is mid-19th century, we find huge attraction to this name as it was attached with celebrity, quality, and it was winning all the shows in these international exhibitions in Europe and America, Australia, etc. We see this between the national shows in the 1840s all the way up until, indeed, we find winners up until the 1900s, where we have other individuals who have remained in Switzerland and are still producing chronometers and watch springs, etc. So this is just a short explanation about these early explorers, these early Columbuses who went out to establish themselves in business in foreign lands, seeking greener pastures, and this drive to flourish in watchmaking, which I find fascinating. But this is a key story in this early development of this brand. So I hope this was informative and of interest on the historical side. And if anybody would have any questions, I would be happy to receive your feedback, etc. No, I just wish you a nice weekend and all the best. Bye-bye.